All right, so now we're turning our attention to this other question. How can our liberties be threatened by the very government that we put over us? How do we keep our government from being tyrannical? Bless his heart. Okay, and that's the issue of what's called separation of powers. It's also known as the slicing and dicing American government. And you will see that in Federalist 47, 48, and in 49 and 50, there's something actually bannered about for a couple rather long paid, Federalist papers, and they ended up at the end of the day saying that's crazy, and I'll give you a paragraph on those too. But the real guts of it starts in Federalist 51. That's one of the most important Federalist papers that's going on. But there is a certain other bouncing ball little argument that I want you to see in Federalist 47 through 51. It's another one that you just want to have in your back pocket because, as most of us are Americans, there's a certain system of government that's been designed to prevent the government from becoming tyrannous over us. Because I may have said this already. If I haven't, let me say it now for the first time, but I think I've already said this. The Federalist argument was that this new system of government created under the Constitution would in fact be more powerful, but it would be safe. And this is largely why it would be safe. Because it would not be tyrannical over the citizens because we will divide its powers. And so you've all heard separation of powers and checks and balances. I'd like to refine your understanding of that here in the next hour. Okay? All right. So let me see what you got from reading Federalist 47 through 51. What is the thing to be avoided at all costs? It starts with a T. Tyranny. What's tyranny? Wouldn't it be great if he just sort of told us what tyranny was? Wouldn't that be awesome? I mean, it'd just be incredible if he just sort of said, by tyranny I mean this. That'd be awesome. It'd be even more awesome if somebody would find it and read it to us. Wouldn't that just be incredible? It might even be in Federalist 47. Maybe even on that first page of Federalist 47. Again, when I posted 47 on Blackboard, there was a series of questions underneath that as you read it, these are the key things to sort of look for that we'll work back through in class, but it's helpful as you come into class sort of already, your mind is chummed with these kinds of things. Anybody want to take a shot? Oh, there it is. There's it. You got it. Almost word for word. It's the accumulation of all powers. What kind of powers does he say? So if you don't have it in front of you, you won't be able to answer that, but if you see it there on the page, somebody tell us, the accumulation of what kinds of powers?
Legislative, executive, and judiciary.
Yep. Okay. That, in essence, is tyranny, isn't it? Saddam Hussein, you're an Iraqi citizen. Why would you fear Saddam Hussein as a tyrant? Because he possessed all three of those kinds of powers. It's a chilling video that you can find on the net that I've seen in numerous occasions, where Saddam Hussein, when he took power, called all sort of the big elites together in the Iraqi nation in this big sort of conference center that they had in Baghdad. And he stood at a podium and he started reading names. And if he called your name, two guys in suits with guns came to your seat and hauled you out and they never saw you again. That's how he came to power. He came to power by eliminating anybody that he saw as a threat to him, and they had him killed. He was their judge, juror, and executioner. That's a tyrant. And the Iraqi people soon came to discover you don't cross this guy. Now that's a gross example, right, of a tyrant. But as you'll notice in Federalist 47 through in that section there in 47, he argues that you can have a tyranny when the judicial power, the executive power, and the legislative power accumulate or coalesce under one person, a few or even a many. And you might have seen something in Federalist 48 about who were our tyrants during this critical period. Did you pick up on that one? Who were the tyrants there? Didn't see that? Uh-oh. That sounds like a magic noise. It was actually the legislative body. So believe it or not, going into the formation of the Constitution, the kind of tyranny that we're seeking to avoid is legislative tyranny. And that may sound funky because we just had a Declaration of Independence where we had a revolution against an executive tyrant. Okay, so let's start walking through the argument here and make sure you see what's going on here. The issue, do you need to get some water? Are you doing all right? Yeah? Okay. The issue of Federalist 47 asks this question, or tries to answer a question. What's important to know is when you read the Federalist paper, out there somewhere is an argument, an anti-Federalist argument, that this Constitution is bad for a certain reason. You're reading why this Constitution isn't bad for that reason. In fact, it's great. The argument out there in the public square of the day was that the new Constitution, as proposed, violates the separation of powers. There's this funky French guy, Montesquieu, who you already know about Montesquieu. How do you know about Montesquieu? Not just because you read a little bit in the Federalist Papers. There's something more about why you would know about Montesquieu. Some of you at least. Anybody encounter the name Montesquieu in your... In what? High school history? I'm thinking more or less academic in that. Good. Anybody watch the movie National Treasure? Book of Secrets? How did Montesquieu come up in that? Anybody remember that? Now see, seriously, the purpose of your education, and I'm not ashamed to admit this even on tape, is so that you can make interesting comments about movies. That's really the purpose here, yeah? Do you remember the scene where that little squirrely fellow is flying the helicopter around the Statue of Liberty that's over in Paris, and Nicolas Cage has to go distract a couple French policemen? Do you remember how he distracted him? He said, oh, you know, our Constitution is based upon your fellow Montesquieu. Remember that? And the Frenchman, oh, well, yeah. Montesquieu was the oracle prophet of separation of powers. And there's a big argument about who gets Montesquieu right. The Anti-Federalists said, no, we get Montesquieu right. The Federalists said, no, we get Montesquieu right. So that's going on in the background here as you see what's going on here. All right, so does the proposed Constitution violate the separation of powers? The Federalists in Federalist 47, 48, and really 51 argue no. We don't violate the separation of powers. The countercharge is that they do. What everybody wants to avoid is tyranny. Tyranny needs to be understood, as we've already framed it, as the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, under one branch. Could be the one, could be executive tyranny. It could be judicial tyranny. It could be legislative tyranny. But those are all examples of tyranny because power coalesces. Now the question is, does a proper separation entail a complete one? So one of the reasons I had you guys read through the Constitution is that you come somewhat familiar with it. And if you were to read the Constitution, you could write down various powers of the different branches of government. And this is something I do to sort of illustrate what's going on here in this back and forth between the Federalist and Anti-Federalist. So let me choose a chief executive. How about us not being our chief executive? So you get the executive powers here, and I'm handing her 3. So the numbers sort of signify something. So she gets 3. Would you like to be the judiciary, ma'am? Are you through coughing? Are you up for the task? You only get 2. And here I have 5. That's the legislative branch. You get to be the legislative branch. Now let's start with her first. Would you like to read us your powers, ma'am? She's the legislative body. And there's something I think you're going to see here as they read through their powers. Please go.
Parchment.
What do you notice about something as they read their powers here? We have 3 different branches of government that read their powers, but is there something you picked up on? Some of these that I chose for them to read, I carefully chose. Yeah?
They have the power to impact the powers of the other.
Ah. The way we'll talk about that is they got a little bit of the other people's business, the other branch's business, don't they? Which one did you have that really impacted? So here's the legislative body again. Which one did really impacted another branch?
Power to confirm appointments to executive.
So the legislative body, most notably the Senate, as you'll see later in the semester, has the power to tell the executive, no, we won't have so-and-so be your Secretary of State. We refuse to put them in place. You can't tell her who she should have, but you can deny her what's called a confirmation. So you've got a piece of her business, don't you? You can actually have a say on who's going to serve in the executive branch. That's interesting. What might you have that impacts the other branches?
Power to strike down any legislative act or executive act.
So she may pass a law that this branch has some kind of legislative oversight over, in some way of saying, no, that's violating of the Constitution, it's void. So that's a piece of the legislative. And you could even say some of her action might not be constitutional and declare that illegal. Interesting. How about you? What do you got?
Power to veto legislation.
Whoa. Now the president has the power to veto legislation. That is a significant legislative power. Now I don't think we need to even go any further here to see that our Constitution violates the separation of powers, doesn't it? I mean, we've seen it. We've seen already that there's a little intermingling of powers here. She's got a little executive influence and maybe even some judicial influence because you can confirm her too. She can't get her job until you confirm her. You've got a little both business and vice versa. Isn't this a violation of the separation of powers? Because if the goal is to keep from having an accumulation of powers, don't we? I mean, even at a first pass here, don't the Anti-Federalists have a point? And that we have a violation of Montesquieu's separation of powers? And that's really what's going on here. So this'll see how much you understood of Federalist 47 anyway.
I'm a little confused. So you're saying that because they intermingle, that is a complete
Yeah.
separation?
So really, here's what's going on with this argument, and unfortunately my board space is limited, so shouldn't this be what separation of powers looks like?
Well, wouldn't it be almost more separation because they intermingle? Because it's like checks and balances.
Man, you're way ahead of us there. You're way ahead. So you're not confused. You're actually ahead. Okay, let's keep it simple. For the rest of us, I'm a simple man, so we have to keep these things simple. All right? Doesn't the fact, I mean, we just heard a very simple recitation of their powers. We could read them directly out of the Constitution if we wanted to. But doesn't that very simple recitation of powers show that this separation of powers has already shown itself to not be what our Constitution is? This would be a complete separation, wouldn't it? That all the executive powers here, all the judicial and all the legislative power is nice and neatly walled off, and that the 3 branches of government have sort of their own gig. She's got all the judicial, all the legislative, all the executive. We've just seen here that we've got some sort of this kind of thing going on, don't we? So doesn't this violate the separation of powers? Asks the Anti-Federalist. And if it does, then we should just rip this up and start over because Montesquieu got it right. We should have separation of powers, and this thing doesn't do it. So that answers this question. And then he goes on to say, did the systems of government that they would have been familiar with back then, like the British governments and various state governments, did they entail this separation of power? All right, now I'd like to hear from you. What does he say in Federalist 47 going into 48? Again, this is a little bouncing ball kind of argument that I want to make sure you see. He starts it by saying, this is what's to be avoided, the accumulation of all powers. So maybe we should avoid the accumulation of all powers by completely walling off and separating these three. Yes, madam.
He says the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments are by no means totally separate and distinct from each other.
Mm-hmm.
The executive magistrate forms an integral part of the legislative authority. He alone, and I think he just talked about
How they intermingle. So there's some intermingling going on here. So don't we have a violation of the separation of powers then? Don't these anti-federalists have a point? At the end of the day, he's going to say no. Why the answer is no is key here for you. And you're already sort of getting to the issue ultimately. Yes, ma'am?
Where it says we're the whole power of one
Ah. Where are you at, in 48 now?
and 47.
You're still in 47. Well, let me get there. My copy of the Federalist paper is getting so tattered, I need to start on another one. Okay, where are you, ma'am? 299. Okay. Please read.
Where the whole power of one department is
Ah.
exercised by the same hands which possess the whole power of another department, the fundamental principles of a free constitution are secured.
Okay. So let's start a little bit earlier in that paragraph to bring it in context. Page 299. From these facts by which Montesquieu was guided, it may be clearly inferred that in saying blah, 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 he did not mean that these departments ought to have no partial agency in or no control over the acts of the others. What he only meant, he goes on to say, was that the whole power of one department shouldn't be subsumed under another. But what's the problem? So here's essentially what the argument is in Federalist 47. Did Montesquieu mean a hold-off, walled-off separation of powers? If that's what he meant, then our Constitution, because of this little deal, and you saw it play out in front of you, violates that. He says, Madison in 47 argues that that's not what Montesquieu meant. All he meant was that the totality of the executive branch shouldn't come over into another branch, and the totality of the legislative. So if we want to have a judicial tyranny, what that would mean is the total executive and total legislative power would both come in here. Then you'd have a tyranny. That's what he says meant. And he gives us examples. We say Montesquieu couldn't have meant that because all of the examples that people would have been aware of in the day, the British government and all these state governments, didn't have a complete walled-off separation. They had what they call partial agency. But now, what's the problem once you allow a partial agency? What's the risk? If you're going to say that separation of powers doesn't entail a complete walled-off separation, that you can have a partial agency, what's now the risk?
Like abuse of power, like when someone has too much.
And how might they get too much would be an interesting question, yes?
Like too much, or like deciding how much power should be applied.
Yeah, how do you maintain just a partial agency and not getting too much? That leads us to Federalist 48. Do you see the bouncing ball here? How do you make sure that one branch of government doesn't get too much? If you allow for partial agency, how do you keep it from getting too much? And here's the classic example. If you're out in the middle of the desert and you're in a tent and you see the camel's nose start to work its way under the tent, what's the fear? That the whole smelly animal's going to be in the tent with you. isn't he? So the proverbial phrase is, the camel's nose gets under the tent, and you don't have to even finish it, right? Once the camel's nose gets under the tent, it's likely now that we're going to have the whole beast inside the tent. Well, the same argument is going on here into Federalist 48, is if once you allow a partial agency, it's a crack in the wall, and now pretty soon, one branch of government is going to suck all power into it and become a tyrant. That's where Federalist 48 picks up the argument. Any insights into how our Federalist friends answer that question? It's getting there. It's getting there ultimately, and you're sort of heading where she said. Any other perspectives on that? Well, let's turn to Federalist 48 here and see what he offers us. So, important aspects of this paper. Tell me what you think he could have meant by this. If you turn to Federalist 48, I'm going to read from the I'm 47, sorry. 48. Now, isn't this nice? So when you're, if sort of the summary of Federalist 47 escaped you, the first sentence of Federalist 48 is sort of just like a summary of everything he tried to tell us in Federalist 47. It was shown in the last paper that the political theory or doctrine there examined does not require that the legislative, executive, and judicial departments should be wholly unconnected with one another. I shall now undertake in this paper to show that unless these departments be so far connected and blended as to give each other a constitutional control over the other, the degree of separation which Montesquieu's maxim requires as essential to free government can't in practice be maintained. So now he's actually turning the argument on the Anti-Federalists and said, if you want to maintain a proper separation of powers, it requires a little intermingling of powers. But of course, the problem becomes when you blend their powers or allow for that little intermingling, how do you prevent one branch from having what he calls an overruling influence on the others? That's the proverbial, once the camel's nose is under the tent, how do you keep the whole beast outside? And this is where he starts to appeal to the track record of this critical period, and he says, we, in the last 7 years, have seen a branch of government that we're particularly worried about becoming our tyrants. Do you recall what branch they referred to there? Ironically, the legislative branches. All right, little history here to sort of help this make sense. Do you remember who, in the colonial times, what a royal governor was? Yeah, royal governor? Did those men have power? If you remember from your high school, American history type stuff, yeah, they had a lot of power. In fact, if the colonial legislature ever did anything that they didn't like, they just dissolved the colonial legislature. Why do I bring this up? Because when the states, under the Articles of Confederation and their own state governments, had a chance to set up their own governors, not royal governors, but elected governors within these states, and Thomas Jefferson at one point in his political career was the governor of Virginia. They set up really weak governors. And what it showed was when you set up a weak governor, you're setting up the legislative branch to be a tyrant, and that's exactly what they found. So if you look on page 307, you see in bold there on the right-hand side of the page, Mr. Jefferson. It's his account of the fact that in his time as governor of the state of Virginia, he says at the bottom of the page, you want to know about despots, tyrants? I had 173 of them. Guess how many people populated the Virginia state legislature? You are brilliant, ma'am. She said 173. This is what the critical period showed, was that if you're worried about tyranny, create weak executives, and the legislative body will become tyrannous over us. Look back on page 306 at the top of the page. It says, the legislative department is everywhere extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex. Now, what's an impetuous vortex? That's fancy language. What's that? What's a vortex? Come on, you sci-fi fans. What's a vortex?
Something that like sucks everything.
Yeah, you don't want to be flying your spaceship near a vortex because you're going to be sucked into it, right? Now, I'm old enough to remember Captain Kirk and Spock and McCoy and Scotty and all those great folks. When we were watching Star Trek back in the 70s and 80s, whenever those guys, were sort of cruising past these areas that they thought was a vortex, they tried to stay away. Inevitably, they found a way to get close enough to where they got sucked into them, and you entertained us for an hour about how they were going to get out of it. But that's what the legislative bodies were doing in that period in which the Articles of Confederation governed. At the state level is where most of the power was, and at the state level, legislative bodies were showing themselves to be tyrants. And that was what they sought to avoid going into the new federal constitution, was that we're now not going to set up a federal legislature that's going to be tyrannical. So how do you keep the legislative body from becoming tyrannical? He says, I got a great idea. You put some words on paper and tell them, here's the line, don't step over it. What did anybody see the answer to that possible solution? It had to do with what's called parchment barriers, words on paper.
That it's been overrated.
In what sense overrated?
That it hasn't worked.
Wouldn't it be awesome if he sort of just tied it all up for us and he said, in conclusion, let me tell you what I've been trying to communicate to you in this paper. In conclusion, wouldn't it be awesome? Yeah, is there such a section of it? Wow. I'm starting to see a pattern here, but go ahead.
Because the conclusion.
Okay. Now, that's pretty fancy language, but does that reasonably make sense to you now in light of what we've been talking about? He says, the conclusion which I'm warranted in drawing from these observations is that the mere demarcation on paper of the limits of the several departments, in other words, drawing boundary lines on paper and saying you can go this far but no further, have shown themselves to be pathetically failures, right? And particularly in regards to the legislative branch. It's the legislative branch that we're really worried about being tyrannous. Now that just log in your mind, because once we start talking about the presidency, and we'll really even start talking about the presidency next week, if you're worried about a legislative tyranny, one of the things you'll want to create is a powerful executive as a check on that legislative branch for a good reason. Okay? So maybe words on paper aren't going to do it. So let's backtrack and make sure what we have here in Federalist 47 and 48. Here's the bouncing ball of the argument. The name of the game is to avoid tyranny. And the way you avoid tyranny is to avoid accumulation of powers into one branch of government. How do you do that? Well, one possible theory is you have complete walled-off separation of powers. When we looked at our system of government, we saw that we didn't have that. You had what's called partial agency or intermingling of powers. So the Anti-Federalists said this thing's a miserable failure because it violates Montesquieu's theory about separation of powers. He argues in Federalist 48 that you can't maintain a proper separation of powers unless you have an intermingling of powers, as we've seen here. And it's going to be that key that's ultimately going to maintain a separation of powers, and we're not there yet. But here's the problem. Once you allow partial agency, how do you keep it from becoming complete? You put words on paper. That'll keep them in their proper bounds. Failure. History, the last 7 years had shown that mere words on paper didn't keep the legislative body in their proper bounds, and they became tyrants. And even someone as notable as Jefferson said, yeah, I had 173 tyrants in Virginia, and it was the legislature. So here's a great idea. Maybe when one branch of government starts to get too out of bounds and starts to become potentially tyrannous, we will appeal to the people themselves, who will sort of call a constitutional convention of opinion, and we'll tell them we're crying foul, and we'll ask the people to slap down the offending branch and send them back in their proper sphere of sort of activity. That was Federalist 49 and 50, and he argues that that's a really bad idea. Largely, can you imagine President Obama standing at a podium today and saying, the American people, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the legislative body is getting a little too big for their britches here, and I would like you to slap them down. I want you to act like a parent and tell them to get back in their yard. And then maybe we all show up at our computers tonight and we vote, yes, I think Obama's right. Legislative, you've been bad boys and girls, get back in your yard. And then next week, some official in the judicial branch goes, you know what? President Obama's getting too big for his britches, and I submit for your attention that you vote him back into his yard, and slap him down. You see, the basic argument of 49 and 50 is that the people would start to lose respect for their government, and they would think that this constitutional order that was set up is just stupid, and they would just not have much reverence for it. That's essentially the argument of Federalist 49 and 50. That's what Federalist 51 is going to refer to as exterior provisions. So if you look at Federalist 49 and 50, it's essentially that argument. It's a long-winded argument basically saying, look, when one branch of government gets out of, gets a little too much, how do I say it? They start to encroach too much on the other branch's powers. Maybe the people might slap them back down. He says that's a bad idea. That's what he refers to as these external provisions or controls that you're going to see here in a second. And then we're moving where you were going to take us, so you're ahead of us. Everybody following this little line of argument? This is what people in the morning newspaper would have been left hanging with. They would have been like, holy cow, how are we going to solve this? Wait till tomorrow when Federalist 48's published. And then you're reading 49 and 50. When 51 comes out, it's the bottom line to how separation of powers is supposed to work. Okay? So I'd invite you now to re-look at 47 and 48, and you'll see more of the argument that he lays out there. Don't revisit 49 and 50 because this is all you sort of need to know about that. Appealing outside the government system, these external provisions to the people, stinks, bad idea. People will start to think the Constitution's a joke and they're not going to take this thing seriously. And that's probably true, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be odd if I'd say, well, guys, I don't know if you're aware, but the president was standing at a podium today and he thinks the legislative body's getting a little bit too big for their britches and wants us to slap them down. Oh, again, geez, it was the legislative body last week complaining about the judiciary. I mean, that would be pretty ridiculous. So now we get to Federalist 51, and he says, here's how the separation of powers will be maintained. And I, again, invite you to consider a movie scene. It's another famous movie. This one's not from National Treasure. It's from Pirates of the Caribbean, one of our favorites. When this goes on in the house, my son and I celebrate, and my daughter and wife roll their eyes and say, do we have to watch that filthy, disgusting Jack Sparrow again? I got my mother-in-law one time to sit through an entire Pirates of the Caribbean movie. My mother-in-law is a nurse, a neat freak, and I made her sit down and watch an entire movie. I think it was the first one of Jack Sparrow. you know, and the whole thing. And every time he came on, I just saw her cringe. And I got some kind of sadistic pleasure out of watching it. I'll be honest with you. Anyway, the movie scene I elude your minds now to is from the, I believe, the second movie, which by the way was the first one I saw when they came out. I was completely lost. There was this heart in a chest, and they were all wanting it for some odd reason, and I was lost. I had no idea what was going on. They were alluding back to Pirates 1 and these kinds of things, and there was this weird dude with tentacles, and yeah, I was just like lost. I literally sat in the movie theater with a buddy of mine going, what is this? I have no idea. Once I went back and watched one and sort of got in the flow of it, I went, oh, I gotta go back and watch this one again, and I really enjoyed it. So there's this heart in a chest, right? And 3 people want this heart more than life itself. Do you recall who those people were? Come on now, you guys have seen the movie? Jack Sparrow. Why does he want the heart? You recall? There's some motivation he has for this heart, and it had something to do with if he had this heart, he could, for eternity, rule be the captain of the Black Pearl. Something like that, right? Who else wanted it? Who? Will Turner. Why did he want it? No, well, yeah, sort of. To free his father from the bounds of his eternal slavery serving under that weird Davy Jones, right? Davy Jones, right? Okay. And then who else wanted it? Huh? No. That was his heart. No, it was the Commodore. The guy who had fallen from like the top military guy to the time where we see him at the beginning of that movie, he's sleeping with pigs. I mean, he really fell. And he wanted his life back. And if he could get that heart, he could use it to get amnesty and get his life back. And there's a certain point in the movie where they have a 3-person sword fight. Do you recall this? That is how the separation of powers was supposed to work. Think of the dynamics of that 3-person sword fight. Every guy in that sword fight, A, has a sword, and B, he's got the motivation to use it, doesn't he? He's got the motivation to use it for various and sundry reasons, but they're each suitably armed and motivated. That's how the separation of powers is supposed to work. So now let's visit some fancy language that talks about that, okay? So if you look at Federalist 51, let me read to you from the good book of Federalist 51. It's not the book of Agape. It is the good book of the Federalist Papers. To what expedient? So now we can't appeal to words on paper to keep these branches in line. We can't appeal outside to the people. So then what shall we turn to make sure that a proper separation of powers is maintained? That's Federalist 51. To what then shall we finally resort for maintaining in practice the necessary partition or separation amongst the several departments? The only answer that can be given is that all these exterior provisions, think that, Federalist 49 and 50, that all these exterior provisions are inadequate. So the defect must be supplied by so contriving the interior structure of the government as that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. What he's going to offer to us is a self-policing system. It's self-policing. You don't go outside the system, you don't put words on paper, but you design a system of government that's made in such a way that literally it will keep itself in order. And again, think back to the 3-person sword fight. When you've got your sword up against one person in that fight, you're always aware that you might have to do this and defend yourself this. And similarly with the other 2 guys in that fight. That's how the separation of powers was supposed to work. That you had the means and motives to resist the advances or potential encroachments of the other branches. And that's what it says down here at the bottom of the page. It is equally evident that the members of each department should be as little dependent as possible on the others for their emoluments, money, annexed to their offices. Were the executive magistrate or judges not independent of the legislature, blah, blah, blah. But the great security against the gradual concentration of the several powers of the same departments consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist the encroachments of the others. The provision for defense, much in all other cases, must be made commensurate to the danger of attack. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Think about that sword fight. All three were ambitious. They had means and motives to be in that fight, but nobody ever won. It was sort of this self-policing system where a proper partition of powers was maintained. And that's what's supposed to happen. It says the interest of the man, going on, must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. And what a pathetic way to have to do it, right? He says, well, look, it may be a sad reflection on human nature that such devices are necessary to control for the abuses of government. But what's government itself but the greatest of all reflections of human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, well, then you wouldn't need internal, external controls. But in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. And that's really what the separation of powers is supposed to do. It's meant to control the government. How? By creating a self-policing system where each branch has the means and motives to resist the encroachments of the others. Now that's in theory. Let's talk about in practice how that might work. Several years ago, around 2006, 2007, President Bush instituted something called the surge. Does this ring any bells for any of you? We were still heavy in war in Iraq. Things weren't going particularly well. And the president said that the solution to the problem was to add about 30,000 new troops to the theater, and that would bring about a different dynamic, and we would, bring about peace in Iraq and all that. And the Democrats who controlled the Congress at the time said, that's a horrible idea. I mean, things are going bad already. You throw 30,000 more guys in, you're just going to make it worse. Bush said, no, we're going to do it. He's the commander-in-chief and says, if I want more guys in the fight, they go to the fight. But here's the interesting thing. You got to pay for it, right? And that's Congress. Congress had to pay for the additional troops to go over to Iraq and get in the battle. So now you've got a problem if you're Bush, because you can say, hey, I want 30,000 guys to go, and they have to go because they have to follow orders, but you got to pay for it. So Congress said this, well, George will give you your money for these additional 30,000 troops, but if you take the money, you have to agree that these troops come out in 6 months. What's going on there? Why would George Bush, as the sitting president of the United States, not like that? Why did he say, if you offer me that deal, I'll veto? Like you have the veto, I'll veto that. Why would George Bush want to veto such a thing? He's getting his money to supply these extra troops. Why would he veto it? Put yourself in George Bush's shoes. Why would you veto that? Yeah, Ezra?
Limiting what he wants, is it limiting the power that, it just seems kind of unproductive then for his main points.
It is. Let's be more specific.
Would it not be enough time to
Maybe. So maybe the issue is not enough time to accomplish what he thought it would take time to accomplish, maybe. Who tells the troops when they come and go? The commander-in-chief? That's unreasonable? Now who's telling the troops when they come and go? Congress. That's a power grab. That's a perceived encroachment on executive power. Bush Now the question is, does the president have the means and motives to resist the encroachment from the legislative body? What means would he have? The veto. That's how the separation of powers classically is supposed to work. He just threatened the veto and Congress caved. Okay, George, you get your money. Essentially what happened. So the Democratic-controlled Congress sort of threatened, this kind of thing, and then they caved like a house of cards because they didn't want to be perceived by the country as sort of leaving our troops without money. So they caved. But Bush said, I'll veto that. That's having the means and motivations to resist the encroachments. Later in the semester, when we talk about the judiciary, you might see that this system, this self-policing system of separation of powers, might have broken down. And you'll see that. Okay, so let's go back through the highlights of Federalist 51 to make sure you got all these. Federalist 51, it seeks to say that, look, it really takes off with the argument of Federalist 48 that says, look, you can't even have you can't have a proper separation of powers or can't maintain a proper separation of powers unless you have some intermingling. And once you have that intermingling, the possibility becomes then that once you allow a little bit of intermingling, that you'll have a whole lot of intermingling and that one branch of government's going to become tyrannous. You don't appeal outside the system, says 49 and 50. 48 concludes that you can't just put words on paper. You have to design a system of government that has internal self-policing controls that will keep the branches in their proper bounds. That's really how the separation of powers is supposed to work. So here's the deal, 21st century Americans or interested third parties. The Constitution invites conflict between the branches of government, most notably between the executive branch and the legislative branch. The Constitution invites it. And the reason it invites it is because they wanted conflict in particularly key areas like war powers, like passing laws, things of that nature, things that really had a lot of oomph. You want conflict because you want to have forced cooperation on things that are really important. You don't want to go to war willy-nilly, and so you have Congress control the purse strings to the war effort. The president tells troops when they come and go, but he's got to get money for them, and so you split the war powers. That's inviting conflict. So when you see in current day America, you see people, oh man, those politicians, they just can't get along and blah, blah, blah. Well, a certain part of that we should lament. I mean, all this partisanship between Democrats and Republicans, I think there is something there that we should sort of roll our eyes and say, come on, guys. I mean, let's act like grown-ups and get some things done here. But in another sense, our Constitution, at least between the branches, invites conflict. And it invites conflict by giving each branch a little bit of each other's business, especially in key areas like war powers, like the legislative function. A very key power that we didn't talk about was her judicial power of what's called judicial review. We'll talk about that in a month or so. That's a very key power that largely has grown over the past 200 years. Okay, so this is the key phrase within Federalist 51 that points us to how this self-policing system is supposed to work. And again, I invite you to picture our Pirates of the Caribbean three-person sword fight. There's a certain dynamic going on there that sort of in your mind you can sort of see a self-policing kind of thing here. And how sad that we got to do that, but at least we're taking into account people for how they really are. Ambitious, maybe greedy for power, and so you design a system of government that takes that into account and you harness it. Now this goes back a little bit when I spoke to you about a little theory several weeks ago. This is a modernist conception of government, that You don't get good government from good men. You get good government from properly constructed institutions that control men's passions. If that interests you, join us next spring for modern political philosophy, which is what we've been dealing with Machiavelli and interesting Thomas Hobbes now and things like that. So join us for that. Now, the legislative branch here, to end our discussion of this, is particularly troublesome. He says in Federalist 51 that the legislative branch is properly and will always be the most powerful branch of government. Why do you think that's the case? Why would the legislative body in a Republican style of governance be the branch of government that would be the most powerful? It is. It's the most close voice of the people and most closely connected with the people. Think about it. The president is connected to the people, but in a little bit more detached kind of way. The representatives and our senators in Congress much more directly sort of represent the voice of the people. The president doesn't have to sort of pay attention to sort of the voice of the people as much as our congressmen or senators do. And because of that, if power derives from the people, the branch most closely associated with the people would be the most powerful branch of government. And so they might be the most to be feared if you're worried about tyranny. So what do you do to that branch? Not only do you divide power like this between branches, you slice and dice the government like this as well. And this is called the slicing and dicing of American government. And before you write it down, let me show you a picture of what that might look like. This is what Federalist 51 refers to as the double security. If you're worried about the accumulation of power, well, you divide it like we've been talking about. You divide it vertically between the different branches of government. Then you might actually divide it horizontally between the national and state government, dividing the pie another way. And then even further, you're taking the legislative branch and dividing it into what's called bicameral legislatures. You divide the will of the legislature between the House of Representatives and the Senate. So if you're particularly worried about these guys, you further even divide them. This is the slicing and dicing of American government. As we've been talking about it, 47 through 51, we've been talking about at the federal level between these three branches of government. Now we're adding this piece. If you're worried about this particular branch, you further divide it into a bicameral legislature where they have to even cooperate amongst themselves to express their will. That's why you have a House and a Senate. We'll talk about that later. And then we also have a division of power between the national and state government. So power is getting sliced and diced pretty good. And the function of slicing and dicing power is to prevent tyranny, accumulating powers. That's how the system of separation was supposed to work. So I'll go back to that previous slide so you can see that. So Madison argues this is the branch of government that we're most worried about. So you divide it into two branches, or I'm sorry, two houses. And as we'll talk about when we get to the legislative branch, there's different modes of election. And they have different terms of service. Members of the House of Representatives serve 2 years and the senators 6. And there's a method to that madness. And because of that, the Senate literally acts differently than the House of Representatives. And we'll talk about that. If you're really worried about a too powerful legislature, you want to especially create a powerful check to that legislature so you don't create a president with a skirt on. Oh, that's not a good example because maybe someday we will have a president with a skirt on. That's man-speak, ladies, for you don't create a mamby-pamby weakling, right? So you create a president, an executive officer, who has real power because he's got to be able to stand up against the branch that predominates in a Republican style of governance. So think about that as we go forward here in the class when we start talking about a powerful presidency. This is another thing the Anti-Federalists were worried about, is a powerful presidency. So you give him something called a qualified veto, and we'll talk about that when we get to the legislative branch here later. Okay? Any questions about that? Do you see sort of the bouncing ball of this? What you need to do to master this argument, again, get in some comfortable jammies, wait for a nice cool evening so you can pull the comforter up around you. I love doing that. I don't get to do that very often in California. As a Midwesterner, that was glorious. You turn the heating blanket on about a half hour before you go to bed. Oh, it's awesome. You don't heating blankets sort of don't do it out here, but we'll pretend. And you pull up the covers and you snuggle up with a good book like the Federalist Papers, and you try to stay awake, and you read 47, 48, you skip 50 and 49 and 50, and you read the first half of 51 again, and you look for this, and the argument will pop off the page at you. Okay? Now the last thing that I want to allude you to, and we'll be talking about this throughout the semester, is another objection that's related but not quite the same here. And that's what you had a chance to poke around with in Federalist 39. And the issue of Federalist 39 was to answer this charge. The kind of governmental system that you're setting up will cause state power to wither on the vine, and we're only going to have a national unitary government. So I was looking at this before class. Here in chapter 5 on page, on page 74, you see this diagram. And the argument of the Anti-Federalists was that this was the only true federalism here at the bottom of the page. What this new constitutional order would create was what you see on the top of this page as a national unitary system, where the only government that we're going to have is a national government. You're creating a national government, and state power is going to wither on the vine, and states' governments are just going to go away. Well, they're wrong about that. After 230 some odd years, they've just shown to be wrong. State government power has not withered, but you could say that federal government power has certainly grown quite a bit. I mean, they are right about that, and we'll talk about that more as we go. The argument of Federalist 39, and again, it may have escaped you in some of the fancier language that goes on in there, was this. No. This new system of government, says the Federalist, is not going to be wholly national like you claim. It's going to be partly that way, but it's also going to be partly federal. And the whole paper reads like this. It's going to be partly federal, partly national, and they give you little examples of nationalist elements and federalist elements of the program, of the new constitutional order. So let me just offer two to you, and so you see the difference. And if there's any questions, we'll address those, and then we're out of here. Take the United States Senate. Tell me what you know about the United States Senate. Who knows something about the United States Senate? Very nice. We have 2 people per state, right? That, as you can see here, is a federal aspect to the Constitution. Federal aspect is where the states sort of speak as states. Why would the Senate be a federal aspect of this new constitutional order? Think about it. She's working up a response back there. You want to take a shot?
Because it gives the states representation and it gives them control over something.
Yes, but in a different way than the House of Representatives, because the states have representation at the House of Representatives level too. What's different about the manner in which states are represented in the Senate versus the House?
Equal representation no matter what the size.
Right. So each state has an equal voice. They speak as a state, 2 senators per state. Doesn't matter how big or small you are, you get 2. So that's where a state sort of speaks as a state on an equal basis. Not so in the House of Representatives, if you can see down here. In the House of Representatives, larger states have more of a say in the House of Representatives than smaller states. So the national element is where we sort of look at the country as a whole. Hey, there's more people over here on the West Coast than there are in Montana. So California gets more of a say in the House of Representatives than Montana does. So that's a nationalist element to the Constitution. So what he's saying in Federalist 39 is they're rejecting the idea that the Constitution creates a wholly national thing and saying it's sort of a hybrid. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. And even some of the things, like the president, the presidency has national elements to it and federal elements to it. The national element I'll give you, and I'll be curious to see if you know what the federal element is to the president. The president is the lone political officer of the federal government that represents the nation as a whole, isn't he? I mean, you can't say that about Senator Boxer from California. She doesn't represent the whole country. And neither does Representative Smith from the 3rd District of Georgia. He doesn't represent the entire country. But President Barack Obama does, and so that makes him a nationalist element to the Constitution. What is it about the presidency that's also federalist, meaning where the states get to weigh in? And I'm thinking particularly in the manner in which we elect the president.
You like electoral college?
Very nice. Very good. The Electoral College. So we'll talk about this in weeks to come. But when a state votes, people in the state cast their votes. But what they're really doing is saying that we think the state's electoral vote should go to A or B, Barack Obama or Mitt Romney or whoever the Republican's going to be. And we'll talk about that. But you vote as a state. So the Electoral College goes, if you get one more vote than your opponent in a state, you get all the state's electoral votes. That's the federal aspect of it. Okay. Questions. That sort of, I just passed through that quickly, but this is a very key response to the Federalist, Anti-Federalist sort of deal that we looked at.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.